So I'm doing an informational presentation on Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was born August 4th, 1792 in a field place near Horsham, Sussex, England, and then he died July 8th, 1822 at sea off Livorno, Tuscany, Italy. Percy Bysshe Shelley is the oldest of his siblings, and he always liked to have fun and play games with them and run around in the countryside. But since he was the eldest, he was going to inherit his grandfather's large estate. But when he started going to school, he was used to being free and playing with his siblings, and so he was bullied because he couldn't really pay attention. He had a harder time controlling his temper, and that's when he started going to school at Scion House Academy. It was the first school that he went to. But then when he started getting older, he went to Eton College when he was 12, and people would call him nicknames, usually like Mad Shelley or Shelley the Atheist. But the older he got, the more he realized he didn't really like the idea of Christianity. He liked the idea of atheism. He didn't like having his whole life in the hands of an almighty being, and he liked the idea that we're all our own people. And so he started developing that idea at an early age, and by the time he was the age of 16, he wanted to convert his religion from Christianity to atheism. This was when he was starting to go to Oxford, and so he went to Oxford in 1810, and he wrote a pamphlet titled The Necessity of Atheism with his friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg, and then he was expelled for denying ownership of the pamphlet in 1811, March 25th. And then later that year in August, he eloped with Harriet Westbrook, who was 16 at the time. After he eloped with Harriet, the years afterwards were demanding. They had their elopement, they went around to Europe, and then they went back to their hometown, and Percy was just working on getting money and being financially stable because he needed money to support his wife, and so he didn't really have a lot of time to study literature with his friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg. But then in 1813, his first major poem came out, and it was Queen Mab. Then in 1814, he fell in love with Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who was married later with her in 1816. And they eloped to France during 1814, though. They took Mary's stepsister Claire Clermont with them. And when they got back from France around September, Percy's grandfather died the beginning of the next year in January 1815. He started receiving an annual income based on his grandfather's will, and this let Percy study his literature a lot more, and instead of working all the time. And then the next year in 1816, during May, Mary, Percy, and Claire went to Geneva to stay with Lord Byron, and Byron was having an affair with Claire later on. But during his stay with Lord Byron, he wrote Hymn to Intellectual Beauty and Mont Blanc while staying at Lord Byron's. They also had a ghostwriting party, and this is where Mary Wollstonecraft started to begin her early ideas of Frankenstein that she would end up publishing later, and Percy would have forward to it because they were married at the time when it was published. But they got back in September, and then a month later, in October of 1816, Mary Wollstonecraft's half-sister Fanny Imlay committed suicide on the 9th of October in 1816. And then on the 15th of December 1816, Percy's first wife Harriet killed herself, and she drowned herself in the Serpentine River near Hyde Park. And then on the 30th of December, Percy Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft got married. And Gary Sloane wrote, after Harriet's death, Shelley was denied custody of his children. His atheism disqualified him for parenthood. And so even though he wanted to take care of his kids, he was mentally unstable because both Fanny Imlay and his wife Harriet both had feelings towards him, and so he felt he was guilty for both of those deaths. But on September 2nd, 1817, Mary Shelley gave birth to Clara Everina Shelley, but when Percy and Shelley moved to Italy in 1818, she died of dysentery. And since it was their first daughter, Percy wrote a poem entitled Lines Written Among the Euganean Hills, and these are the last few lines of the poem. The inspired soul supplies with its own deep melodies and the love which heals all strife. The love that heals all strife, circling like the breath of life, all things in that sweet abode with its own mild brotherhood. They, not it, would change, and soon every sprite beneath the moon would repent its envy reign, and the earth grow young again. And that was just him trying to get his emotions out, because he was very depressed during that period of time in his life. But then during most of the time after his daughter died of 1818 to 1820, Percy spent most of his time writing. He published Prometheus Unbound, Ozymandias, Ode to the West Wind, The Cloud to a Skylark, Ode to Liberty, and then he translated Plato's Symposium. And then after he moved to Pisa, Italy, he wrote Epipsychidion, and then he wrote Adonis to commemorate the death of his friend John Keats. This is when he died, and so when Percy was returning from Leghorn to go back home in Laircy, he had two companions with him, Mr. Williams and Charles Vivian. The boat disappeared for 8 days, and they had no idea where it went, and so they kept searching for him in the harbor, looking for him where he disappeared in Tuscany, Italy, off the shore, and so they had no idea where he was. And then after 8 days, the bodies of Shelley and Mr. Williams came to shore, but first his articles or pieces of the boat came before that, but they were found on the shore of Via Reggio. Their bodies were pretty decomposed and full of water, and so instead of having a normal funeral, like where they take him up and bury him, they set their bodies on fire on the beach, and they had funeral pyres, and they just burned both of the bodies. And then 3 weeks after the ship's disappearance, so a week and a day was 8 days when Percy Shelley's body was found, and then 3 weeks later was when Charles Vivian's body was found. So it just shows how wild the ocean was and how terrible the storm was that night when they both fell off, when their boat was destroyed and they drowned. But one of the people that was present at the funeral was Lord Byron, and he's the one that was cheating with Claire Clairmont, on his wife with Claire Clairmont. But they took his ashes and they collected them all, and then he was buried in the Protestant burial ground in Rome near his dead child, and when they first moved to Italy, and his friend John Keats, who he wrote the poem for. One of the best ways to sum up his life was one of the things that I found from Thomas de Quincey, and he wrote, "Everything was romantic in his short career. Everything wore a tragic interest. From his childhood, he moved through a succession of afflictions, always craving for love, loving and seeking to be loved. Always he was desired to reap hatred from those with whom life had connected him." And then I cut a few lines out, and he says, "Gladly he would have slept in eternal seclusion, whilst eternally the trump summoned him to battle. In storms unwillingly created by himself, he lived in a storm, sighted by the finger of God, he died." So that was my informational presentation for Masterpieces of British Lit 2, and my sources were from Poetry Foundation, Gary Sloan, which he was on Gale Literary Sources, and it was American Atheist Magazine, Volume 41, Issue 4, G.M. Matthews, who's British Writers, Volume 4, which was also on Gale Literary Sources, Thomas de Quincey, the works of Thomas de Quincey, Volume 6, biographical and historical essays that he published himself, and then for most of the dates and stuff I got from Merriam-Webster's Encyclopedia of Literature and Historical Essays, which was also on the Gale Literary Sources for Snow College.